Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety, and we're looking at a passage from Luke chapter 16. When you look at verse 1 of this chapter, it might suggest that there's been a change in audience since the previous chapter, but Luke indicates that the next parable Jesus tells is to his disciples. However, at the end of the story, there's a reaction from the Pharisees, so it's clear that they never left the scene from the previous stories. But Luke is indicating that the teaching Jesus was giving in the story of the money manager was directed to his disciples. It appears that the Pharisees were probably eavesdropping. They were certainly paying attention to what Jesus was teaching. The teaching Jesus was giving his disciples, they were paying attention to. So in the previous chapter, Luke noted that the Pharisees were complaining because Jesus was accepting the wrong crowd, even having celebratory meals with them. And the Pharisees and the teachers of religious law complained that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. You see that in verse 2 of chapter 15. But after they heard the parable in Luke 16, they go from complaining to mockery. They say in verse 14 of chapter 16, the Pharisees, who dearly loved their money, heard all this and scoffed at him. The irony of this is that the Pharisees were accusing Jesus of compromising the law of Moses, which they believed explained why tax collectors and sinners were among his faithful followers. But it's clear from the text that the problem is that the Pharisees dearly loved their money. Their religious pride was connected to their social pride, as was their wealth. So to demonstrate the importance of hearing the law of Moses, Jesus tells the story of a rich man and a beggar named Lazarus. It says, like the tax collectors and sinners, Lazarus, the beggar, was a social outcast. So in light of the first story in Luke chapter 16 about a money manager that was being fired and feared he would become a social outcast, we can almost see that the description of Lazarus in this story reflects what that money manager might have wound up, or where he might have wound up. It was also clear that Jesus intended to identify the Pharisees with the rich man in this story. And the climax of the story indicated that the rich man had ignored hearing the law of Moses in spite of his wealth. It also indicated that the social outcasts are accepted in the bosom of Abraham. So once more, the story demonstrates how the religious elite are rejected because of their unrepentance, while the socially outcasts are included in the kingdom of God because of their repentance. So, Sheryl, what kind of lessons can we get from reading about the difference between how Jesus responded to sinners and how the Pharisees thought about sinners?
Well, the Pharisees thought that sinners were disgusting and disgraceful and people to be avoided and even shunned in society, really. And it seems like they were much more interested in how elite their religion made them than they were in feeling that it was something that brought them freedom and that they wanted to share that with other people and see them find the same thing. Where I feel like Jesus loved people more than he disliked their sin.
Right.
He could see people's hearts and he understood how burdened they were by the sins that they carried. And of course, he disliked their sins, but he wanted to set them free from that, not make them feel ashamed of it.
Why do you think religious people are so susceptible to pride?
Like, who is religious? Are you and I religious?
Well, it depends on who you ask. There would be some people who would think we were religious. When I say religious, I think more of routine and practice than I do heart change, right? It's more head knowledge than it is heart knowledge.
Well, I would say that most of that would be based on the fact that they feel they have continued to meet all those qualifications and follow all of the rules that have been set up for them, most of which we know are man-made. But if you're doing all that and you believe that that is the way that you become righteous, then it's easy for you to think, well, I'm doing all that well, and this person isn't, so it's pretty easy for me to look down on them. And I also think if you're talking about people who are Christians being religious, if, that's like a blanket term that we would put over people who are Christ followers, that we can still be susceptible to that, because I think especially in areas where somebody is struggling with something that either you no longer struggle with or you never have struggled with. And it seems simple to you, but it's easy for you to look down on people and feel prideful that, well, you don't have that issue. You've never struggled with that. And it
Right.
makes you, when in reality, you have issues that they don't. But we can be dishonest with ourselves about those things.
I think most of the time we are dishonest about some things. I often warn people. Some of this is from experience, but I'll hear people say, and they mean well when they say it. I would never, and you can fill in the blank, right? The one that is most common is I would never cheat on my spouse, right? That's the most common. And I am a firm believer, right? I'm 57, having had some unfortunate experiences in my own life and having walked with lots of other people, that there is a right person, right time, right situation. Now, all of them may have to converge at the same time, right? That would cause you to at least consider compromising your integrity, right? And we say things and we mean well, right? When we say them. What is it?
I think my comment has been, I couldn't imagine having the time and energy for that.
Well,
sorry.
I'm getting to the point in my life. I've been so busy. Like, right? Yeah. Where do you find time
in the world?
But
people who got a lot more time on their hands than me, I guess.
Well, you never know. I mean, but there are always things, right?
I understand what you're saying, though.
You say there are some things I don't relate to, right? I'll hear people say, "Oh, there's nothing better than a cold beer on a hot day." Well, I can think of about 4,000 better things than a cold beer on a blazing hot day. Now, if that's all, right? Because that's just, it's not something I'm attracted to. I desire. I don't understand illicit drugs, right? I don't understand. Like I've always said, if I tried smoking a joint, the ATF and the FBI and the CIA will all convert at one time, right?
But then you struggle with things that other
that's
people
correct,
can't relate
right?
to.
But if you ask me, like, do you know why there are billboards for if you have a gambling problem, call this number. I can understand that, right? I know. Yeah. I see how that path gets there, and I think too often Chris Hodges he says a statement: "Time in erodes awareness of." So the longer you're in something, it's like living in your house. The longer you live there, you get used to that crack in the wall, right? You get used to that whatever's out of, balance. But, and the same is true in the longer you're in church, it erodes your awareness of how susceptible you are to sin. You think, I'm above this. I would never do that. It's like going to Walmart to feel better about yourself, because I mean, you want to think you're better than what you really are, right?
And I think one of the most dangerous parts about that unawareness is, in yesterday's podcast, we talked about being welcoming to people who are not Christians yet and celebrating with them when they do get saved. And I think one of the most dangerous things for us who have been in the church world for a long time is finding it hard to relate to people who don't know what salvation is yet. Because if you can't have a conversation with them, or you can't relate to what it is that they're carrying around, what they're looking for freedom for or with, it makes it pretty hard to help them find it.
So what are some ways we can guard as believers and as churches against becoming prideful about those kind of things?
Well, I think we kind of touched on it already. And one of those things is just learning to be honest with yourself and having other people in your life who can be honest with you. Because, it's hard to hear those things, but if somebody loves you enough that they want to see you not struggle with that, or they see you sliding down this slippery slope, they don't want to see you hit the bottom. It's if you have, even if it's just one person in your life that is willing to point those things out to you because they love you, not because they're trying to criticize you. I think that that's a huge help.
Yeah.
And I also think again that we just have to really learn to be honest with ourselves about things and be able to admit it when we are really struggling with something, because those things can change. I have found, especially I'd say in the last 10 years of my life, that the things I feel myself struggling with now are way different than the things that I was struggling with
Sure.
10 years ago. And, just because something I was struggling with 10 years ago may no longer be a struggle doesn't mean I don't have any. It just means they're new.
Or that you don't need to pay attention.
That's right.
To know those things could be.
Yeah.
You just think, okay, I've got them. We got a better handle on them.
Mm-hmm.
I would say self-awareness is one of the greatest gifts you can have. Sometimes I'll hear people talk about a situation and I'll go, you are completely unself-aware, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can think, as I was saying that, two people came to my mind who consistently speak sharp to other people, right? Consistently say snide remarks. I preached a sermon recently about cutting remarks. You know something's eating at them, but they never tell you what it is, right? It's like a drive-by slashing,
Yeah.
and you go, where did that come from? But if you ask them, they are completely unself-aware. Like they will remark about other people,
treating them that way.
Yeah, but they're completely like, oh no, I'm so kind. They think they are, I'm compassionate. It's not that we don't all have blind spots. We do. We all have blind spots. I have blind spots. But we have to be aware. And if we say them, right, it does help keep us humble, right? It's always troubling to me when somebody says, I could really help you if you would let me, right? I believe there are people who can help me, right? But like if you're that, why don't you fix this over here, right? Why don't you let's talk about this first before we, let you be my coach, kind of thing. And I think a lot of people just aren't self-aware about their weaknesses, their struggles.
Yeah.
There are some things that I just don't do because I just know they would be unhealthy for me. They could lead to a bad place. I think we just have to know ourselves, and then we have to put up. We did a series here a number of years ago that North Point Church had put out.
I bet I know what it was called.
Called Guardrails.
Yep.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't know where the hard turns are in your life, right?
Yeah.
If you don't know where the dangerous spots are, you don't need them. They don't put guardrails on a 35-mile-an-hour, downtown street.
Mm-hmm.
They put them on high-speed places, right? And it's in the high-speed areas of life that I think you have to be most guarded.
I would just say, to encourage people on this point, I highly recommend people, if you're not part of a life group and you don't want to be, at least have some friends who are willing to be upfront and honest with you about the struggles that they have, because you can really help each other out through that process, not only by being able to talk about it, but having somebody who can be objective about it with you, and you can help walk each other through it. I think that self-awareness is very important, but I also think you should never feel like you're having to deal with it alone.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Luke.